June 19, 1944. Reports began arriving at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters that at first seemed impossible. Carrier air groups were being shredded in numbers no naval engagement had recorded before. Planes that had taken off from Japanese carriers to strike an American fleet never made it to the fight. Squadrons that had left the decks at dawn simply did not return. By nightfall, the ledger read like a punchline to a nightmare. Roughly 200 carrier fighters, Mitsubishi A6M Zeros and their companions, were gone from the order of battle in a single day. How could 200 Zeros vanish in one day? This is the question that drives the story of the Marianas fight, a clash where tactical evolution, technological advantage, and the attrition of experience met in one decisive moment. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had assembled 9 carriers and approximately 430 carrier-based aircraft with a singular, desperate objective: to stop the American thrust toward the Marianas and protect the islands that would become vital bases. Opposing him was Task Force 58, a massive American formation built to project air power, 15 carriers, an array of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, escort vessels, and well over 900 carrier aircraft. The numerical imbalance was stark. What made the day catastrophic for Japan was the convergence of that imbalance with a string of technological and doctrinal advantages the Americans had honed since 1941. If you like deep military history, subscribe for more. To understand why so many planes disappeared in a single day, we need to look at 4 interlocking dimensions: the operational plan that sent Japanese aircraft far from their carriers, the machines and men who flew them, the American systems that detected and met them, and the brutal chronological sequence of 4 strikes that unfolded across the afternoon sky. Ozawa's plan was bold and born of necessity. With the Marianas invasion looming, the Imperial Navy could not simply wait. It had to strike the Americans before they could close for the invasion, or else watch the islands fall, and with them Japan's chance to prevent long-range bomber bases from being established. Ozawa ordered extreme-range strikes, flights that would take aircraft hundreds of miles across open ocean, out beyond their usual operational envelope. The idea was to hit first, disrupt the American formation, and force the enemy to react. On paper, daring and surprise might have worked. In practice, long ranges, limited fuel margins, and the loss of veteran aircrew combined to make those flights perilous even before contact. The contrast with earlier years of the Pacific War could not be sharper. In 1941-42, the Zero had been a dominant fighter, light, highly maneuverable, and flown by experienced cadres. By mid-1944, the profile had flipped. The veterans who had won early engagements were casualties of campaigns that had consumed their experience. Replacement pilots, hurriedly trained, often had only a few dozen hours of flight time and minimal carrier experience. They lacked the practiced instincts, gunnery discipline, and formation proficiency that separate survival from catastrophe in mass strikes. One survivor later recalled the feeling of flying with squadrons whose cohesion dissolved as planes were hit. Pilots dispersed, anchors of experience were gone, and coordination with bombers became fragile. That loss of skilled leadership at the stick changed the nature of every engagement. Aircraft themselves played a decisive role. The A6M Zero was still a light and highly maneuverable fighter, but by 1944 it carried design compromises that had become liabilities rather than strengths. To preserve agility and range, early Zero designs sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. They were vulnerable to the modern, heavier American fighters. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, fielded in large numbers by Task Force 58, arrived with practical advantages: more robust structure, armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing tanks that reduced the chance of catastrophic fire, and heavier firepower. More critically, the Hellcat could operate effectively in boom and zoom engagements, using superior speed and diving attacks from altitude to hit opponents with energy before climbing back to a position of advantage. Against inexperienced pilots flying lightweight Zeros, that doctrine was lethal. Technology off the airplanes mattered too. The American carrier force enjoyed an integrated radar network that provided early warning and fighter direction control. Long before Japanese strike formations approached the fleet, American radar screens alerted combat information centers, and fighters were vectoring to intercept at altitude. The Japanese radar picture, by contrast, was limited. Detection at range was no longer a gamble for the Americans. It was a systematic advantage that let them choose the terms of engagement. When combined with improved shipboard fire control, the result was an aerial kill zone around the fleet. Shipboard defenses had also taken a leap. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, designed to detonate near an aircraft rather than on direct impact, created lethal clouds of shrapnel that could destroy or cripple planes long before they reached the carrier. Radar-directed fire control allowed ships to concentrate these shells where approaching formations were anticipated, turning the final miles of an attacker's approach into a gauntlet. Submarines operating in the area contributed to the attrition as well. They found and struck carriers that, even if they survived the air battle, were crippled and later lost. The battle itself unfolded in 4 principal strikes, each offering a window into how a cascade of advantages translated into devastating losses. The first strike was a probing effort. 69 aircraft were launched, pushing out toward the American fleet. Roughly 150 miles out, American radar picked them up. Fighter director officers scrambled Hellcats, sending them to high-altitude intercept positions. The Japanese attackers, partly formation broken and carrying fuel for the long trip, met grinding opposition from the air. Hellcats, diving from altitude and concentrated shipboard AA fire, reduced their numbers before they could get within bombing range. By conservative counts from operational reports on the day, 42 of those 69 were shot down before reaching the carriers. The survivors who did make contact ran into a second level of defense, well-coordinated CAP, combat air patrol, that had altitude advantage, and chorus-like defense from ships. The toll of the first strike was a grim forecast. The second strike was larger, some 130 aircraft committed. But scale offered no immunity. Again, radar detection allowed the Americans to marshal a layered defense. Hellcats massed at altitude for slashing passes. Shipboard anti-aircraft fire, using proximity shells set to burst near incoming planes, tore into bomber formations and their fighter screens. The result was catastrophic. Reports indicate approximately 97 of those 130 aircraft were destroyed in the course of interception and the failed approach. A combination of high-speed fighter attacks and the exploding shells that filled the air left little room for the lightly protected Japanese airframes to survive long enough to press the attack. The third and fourth strikes continued the pattern. The third saw about 47 aircraft launched. They met similar fates, intercepted at range, disrupted in formation, and picked off by fighters and AA before they could deliver ordnance. The fourth sortie, a larger effort with around 82 aircraft, again suffered heavy losses. Across all 4 strikes, the totals coalesced into a grim arithmetic. Roughly 330 Japanese aircraft were launched overall. Fewer than 100 returned to their carriers that day. In-day losses of Japanese aircraft approached and exceeded 200. American aircrew losses were comparatively light. Operational reports list approximately 29 American aircraft lost over the course of the encounters. Those figures underline a brutal asymmetry. The sea itself took its toll on Japan's carrier force. Submarines, acting in concert with the air-sea battle, found opportunity. Taiho, a modern fleet carrier, suffered fatal damage from a submarine attack and ultimately sank. Shokaku was also lost to submarine action in the days surrounding the engagement. Carriers that remained afloat were often heavily damaged, and battleship and cruiser escorts like South Dakota and Bunker Hill sustained battle damage as the larger campaign unfolded. The physical losses, aircraft, trained pilots, and carriers, translated not just into numbers on a report, but into an erosion of capability that could not be quickly reversed. Why did this happen in one day? Why did decisions, technologies, and the patience of history conspire to make June 19th so decisive? The answer is multi-layered. First, numerical superiority mattered. Task Force 58 could mass fighters in numbers that outpaced what Ozawa could oppose. But numbers alone are rarely decisive without systems. The Americans had integrated those numbers into a networked defense. Radar provided early detection, fighter direction offered coordinated interception, The Hellcat's performance enabled effective slashing attacks, and shipboard AA with proximity fuses ensured that surviving attackers faced additional destruction. When aircraft are funneled into a defended zone, even marginal protective advantages, self-sealing tanks, pilot armor, accumulate into survivability that multiplies across a squadron. Second, the human dimension mattered as much as the metal. Japanese naval aviation had been hollowed out by nearly 3 years of attrition. Veteran leaders, squadron commanders, experienced wingmen, had been lost in previous campaigns. Replacement pilots were raw, limited flight hours, fewer carrier landings, and less exposure to large-scale coordinated defenses. The discipline required to maintain formation, to keep up situational awareness, and to execute coordinated attacks evaporated under intense pressure. One pilot who survived later described how, as the formation took hits, cohesion dissolved and pilots made desperate isolated runs that exposed them to concentrated fire. That loss of experience meant that even skillful aircraft could not be used to their best effect. Third, doctrine and tactics had diverged. The Japanese had historically celebrated dogfighting and maneuver. The Americans, learning fast, had shifted tactics to exploit energy fighting, using altitude, speed, and coordinated teamwork to strike opposing formations decisively. The Hellcats' willingness to trade tight maneuverability for ruggedness and speed favored boom and zoom tactics. In the Marianas engagement, the Americans dictated the altitude and the vectors of combat. The Japanese were drawn into fights where their aircraft design and pilot experience were at disadvantages. Fourth, logistics and production pressures shaped the backdrop. Training pipelines had become stretched. Fuel shortages and material constraints affected how much practice could be given to new pilots. Industrial strain meant Japan could not easily replace losses in trained air crews or modernize designs at the pace necessary. The systemic pressures of war, the grinding attrition of men and materiel, set a stage on which a single tactical advantage could cascade into strategic defeat. American reports from carriers and fighter pilots underscore the systematic nature of the day. Pilots described climbing to altitude on vector, finding Japanese formations already disordered by the time they arrived, then rolling into coordinated attacks that left few targets able to respond effectively. Shipboard logs recorded radar tracks, the timing of launches, and the pounding of proximity-fused AA as attackers neared. The combination of airborne interception and naval gunfire created a kill envelope that turned the approach corridors into death traps for the attackers. But numbers alone do not capture the human texture of the moment. Some survivors spoke in later accounts of the surreal quality of the sky, planes streaming in from the horizon, tracer curtains, and the sudden emptiness as comrades were hit. Others remembered the thin, hot panic of fuel gauges and the slow, helpless descent when a fuel tank had been punctured by shrapnel. The day was not a single mass slaughter, it was thousands of micro-moments, pilots making split-second decisions, gunners on ships tracking blips on a screen, submariners slipping into firing positions, commanders trying to piece together an accurate picture from fragmentary reports. When the smoke cleared, the strategic consequences were immediate and severe. The loss of 200 carrier fighters in one day did not simply reduce aircraft counts, it removed the capacity of Japanese carriers to mount sustained, coherent offensive air operations. Carriers require air groups that can be launched, recovered, refitted, and relaunched with coordinated doctrine. The depletion of trained pilots and the loss and damage of carriers meant that the first mobile fleet could no longer project the concentrated carrier air power it once had. That shift opened the Marianas to invasion. With Saipan, Tinian, and Guam falling into American hands, a new phase of the war began. These islands would host bases from which the B-29 superfortress could reach the Japanese home islands. The operational reach of land-based bombers altered strategic calculations. Japan's ability to interdict or contest those bases was compromised, not in a single instant, but as an inevitable result of lost carriers, planes, and the trained crews who made them effective. It is tempting to attach a single dramatic label to that day, the turkey shoot, as some contemporaries called air combat where one side suffered massive losses. But that label risks flattening complexity. The vanishings were not mysterious disappearances. They were the product of measurable material disadvantages and operational misfortune: radar detection at range, fighter direction control, the arrival of Hellcats capable of diving attacks, proximity-fused shipboard AA, the erosion of Japanese training and experience, the stretching of Japanese logistics. Each factor contributed. Separating them into single causes is misleading. The truth is cumulative and precise. Systems layered against systems built an overwhelming defensive net that, on that day, snapped shut. Strategically, the loss marked a tipping point. Japan had already been on a difficult footing by mid-1944. The Marianas engagement accelerated a decline that would grow irreversible. Fewer trained carriers and pilots, fewer opportunities to contest sea control, and the loss of strategic islands that enabled long-range bombing. In operational terms, the naval balance shifted toward the United States. The Marianas would be bases for strategic bombing that struck at the heart of Japan's industrial and civilian infrastructure in the months that followed. There is a symbolic weight to the statement that roughly 200 Zeros vanished in a single day. Militarily, it signifies the effective end of a generation of Japanese naval aviation dominance. The veterans who had ensured early war successes were gone. The industrial and training capacity to rebuild that elite was strained beyond its limits. Politically and emotionally, the disappearance was visible proof to commanders and civilians alike that the tide had turned. The sight of carriers returning with small diminished air groups and the tally of lost planes made the broader strategic situation undeniable. Yet the human cost and the operational consequences should be kept in balance. Japanese courage and sacrifice were present on that day, as they are in every combat account, but courage does not equal strategic capability. The battle's outcome was not a moral judgment. It was an operational reckoning driven by material realities. Loss of life and the erosion of professional skill both mattered, and both were tragic. For historians and enthusiasts, the Marianas fight offers several lessons. First, technological innovations, radar, proximity fuses, and aircraft design do not produce victory independently. They do so when integrated into doctrine and training. Second, attrition of skilled personnel can be more damaging than raw losses of equipment because experience is hard to replace. Third, the ability to detect and shape engagements at range shifts the advantage dramatically. Control of information, knowing where and when an opponent will arrive, can outweigh many other factors in battle. Finally, strategic geography matters. The islands taken after June 19th enabled operations that reached deep into previously protected enemy spaces. To close the operational narrative, here is a concise timeline of the crucial days. On June 18th, reconnaissance and positioning set the stage. Both fleets took up search patterns and prepared for contact. On June 19th, Japanese carriers launched 4 principal strikes, 69, 130, 47, and 82 aircraft respectively, each intercepted by American radar-guided fighter defenses and shipboard AA. Losses mounted immediately, and submarines later found wounded carriers. By the evening of June 19th and into June 20th, the strategic outcome was clear. Japan's carrier air power in the theater had been severely degraded, and American amphibious operations continued to the Marianas with reduced risk of carrier-based counterattack. If the phrasing of the title, Uncovering the Shocking Disappearance of 200 Zero Fighters in Japan, grabs attention, it does so because the day spelled an abrupt and visible turning point. The disappearing planes were not a mystery in the supernatural sense. They were the visible result of layered advantages, systemic attrition, and operational decisions made under extreme pressure. In the space of hours, the balance of naval air power shifted, opening the way for operations that would further isolate and pressure Japan on multiple fronts. June 19, 1944, remains a stark study in how tactical, technical, and human elements combine to produce strategic outcomes. The numbers, roughly 330 Japanese aircraft launched, fewer than 100 returned, and about 200 destroyed in the engagement, are not merely statistics. They are the arithmetic of a capability lost. The sinking of carriers like Taiho and Shokaku, the damage to other capital ships, and the loss of trained air crews compounded into an operational incapacity that had consequences far beyond that single day. For those who want to dig deeper into unit reports, pilot accounts, and operational logs, primary sources and detailed timelines are available in the description and our documentary playlist. There you can find the carrier action reports, survivor testimonies, and analyses that underpin the figures and interpretations summarized here. This was not a moment of sudden, inexplicable disappearance. It was the moment when the cumulative weight of material and human factors made a decisive outcome inevitable. If you find this deep dive useful, check the description for sources and our full playlist on Pacific naval aviation. The Marianas fight is a pivot in history worth revisiting, because understanding how those 200 fighters vanished helps explain how the wider war changed afterward.